Welcome back. I got to tell you that our next two speakers have been here so often to the presidential election program that Mark and I are thinking about seeing if we could get them some fellowships here. But Carl, it doesn't pay. I got to tell you first. It's a great delight to introduce to the smartest guys that come into this building from time to time. Karl Rove, everyone knows, prominent political strategist and policymaker who's had a significant impact on not only his party but the whole political landscape of the United States. You know his background: Deputy Chief of Staff and Senior Advisor to President George W. Bush. He's taken part in so many statewide elections it's impossible to keep up with. He's a columnist for the Wall Street Journal, and he's quite frankly one of the smartest guys in politics. Major Garrett is Chief Washington Correspondent for CBS News, and he's part of a small fraternity of national journalists who've had their roots here in Houston. That includes Walter Cronkite, Dan Rather, Linda Ellerby, and the inimitable Kay Bailey Hutchison, so you're in good stead.
Thank you.
I'll leave the floor to you guys.
Excellent.
Thank you so much.
John. Thank you. Carl and I decided to come up a couple minutes early to give you a little more bonus content. Carl, it's great to see you. It's always great to be here at the Baker Institute. I'm always grateful to be invited back. I know Carl is too. So Carl, let's start off the top. Anything about this election surprise you?
Not a damn thing.
Okay. Anything that surprised the Democrats that shouldn't have?
Well, first of all, it was a weird election. Let's be honest about that. From start to finish, it started with the fact that both of the likely nominees of their respective parties began 2023 as the most unpopular front runners for their party's nominees in the history of polling. I went back in the Gallup database to 1936, and no pair of, potential of the leading nominees, front runners, were as unpopular as these two guys were. And then, June 27th, the earliest presidential debate. I want to know who the person was inside Biden world that said, let's go do a June 27th debate, because as a country, we owe them a deep debt of gratitude. It would not have been good for our country to have him be the nominee of the Democratic Party and go into the general election with somebody who is completely incapable of conducting a campaign. We're better off as a country when we have a spirited debate between two people that the country says, many people in the country say no matter who is likely to be the president, that we'll be okay. And that would not have been the case had he been the nominee. And then the attempted assassination on July 15th, the Republican National Convention, which was an extraordinary moment, particularly the opening night when Trump spoke, and particularly the first 18 minutes, which I've been to every convention since '72, and I never have seen a moment like those first 18 minutes. Of course, it was followed by 62 minutes of total, complete crazy, but that, and then 8 minutes at the end. My personal favorite out of the whole address was, "We're going to cure Alzheimer's and cancer so quickly, and men will not be allowed to participate in women's sports." Now, I'm in favor of all three of those things, but I don't, when I get up in the morning, don't say kill cancer, kill Alzheimer's, and no men in women's sports. How those things ended up being there together, I don't know.
It's called the weave, Carl.
Yeah,
it's called the weave.
There was no copy of the speech.
No.
So I'm sitting in the Fox booth. Normally, when you have a major address, because you've got to have the producers get the cameras on at the right time, and so, but 15 minutes into the speech, in walks this person, and I think Rupert had gotten a copy of the speech, because there's a copy of the speech. They've quickly run it off on a Xerox machine and given it to us, and it's got some scribbles on it that I sort of saw were familiar handwriting. And so I'm following the speech, and it would be like, "We're going to have tariffs, it's a beautiful word." And I'm reading the speech. And then there are like 3 or 4 paragraphs that aren't in the speech. And it's like, we're the weave, and we're out there, and they don't come back. We're going to cure cancer and Alzheimer's so quickly. And I'm like, this is like the weirdest, nominating speech or acceptance speech I've ever heard in my life.
But is there something that Democrats were surprised about that they shouldn't have been?
That there was such resistance to the whole idea of the economic agenda of the incumbent administration. They thought that people would say things are getting better, and you know, look, I took a marketing class when I was a freshman in college, and I learned one thing: if you got a lousy product, do not put your name on it. And these people went out and said Bidenomics is working. And they, I think, were surprised by the fact that people didn't say, oh yeah, okay, inflation's coming down, unemployment's pretty good, GDP is so-so. Stock market is great, and therefore
interest rates are coming down. There is a directional benefit or beneficial.
Yeah. But they didn't understand that people were coping with in their everyday life the effect of 3 years of bad stuff.
Right.
And it's one thing to say things are getting better, and then people going home and saying, I'm still finding it difficult to take the paycheck at the end of the month, and it's enough to pay the bills that I got sitting in front of me.
When I traveled across the country, there wasn't a single voter, Harris or Trump, who could not recite to me the cost of eggs.
Yeah.
I swear to God, every single one. And that's the kind of tactile piece of information that ought to have been a signal. Is there anything that Kamala Harris could have done differently to win?
You know, I'm thinking about writing about it this week, actually, because I read that some of the reports on the Harvard Institute of Politics thing. Yeah, there are a couple of things that she could have done that I think
within the time limit that she had.
Yeah, that would have made it better. One is she could have on The View said, I can think of one thing that at least one that I would have done differently
than Biden.
And then the ambassador and I were talking about this. It was a mistake for her to surround herself with Hollywood and the glitterati. People wanted to know more about her, and having having Oprah and everybody else obscured moments. It took away moments where they could have learned about her. But yeah, she needed to say, I'm different. And she was never able to articulate that. Maybe it was a question of time. You become the nominee, de facto nominee, after July 21st when Biden pulls out. That's not a lot of time.
Nope.
But she was burdened with a lot. His approval ratings were in the 30s, high 30s, on the biggest of the four biggest issues of the election: the economy, inflation, the border, and crime. Those were the four. Those were bigger than health care and abortion. His approval ratings were in the 30s on all of them.
Right. Is there anything that Donald Trump could have done to lose the election?
Not turned his head at the right moment. I don't know. Maybe.
Meaning the fundamentals were such that it was unlosable for him? Because clearly there were things he did that brought negative attention, negative headlines. Even within his own campaign, they wished hadn't gone the way they did, and still he won.
Yeah, but I think that's more if I had to pick between, was there something he could do to lose? Yeah, but he didn't do that.
Right.
I think what happened was that at the end of the day, and this may be a problem that he faces in office, this election was decided by people, and you know them, who said, he's crazy, he says weird shit, he does weird shit, but I can't run the risk of having her in office because she was so burdened by what Biden had done or not done that I think it caused the election to be decided by people who said, he's not my favorite, but he's better than her.
I was in New York last week at the New York Times Deal Book Summit for a conversation about this election. There was a very lively debate between those on the Harris side and the Trump side about whether this election was or was not a blowout.
Now, look, it was not a blowout. In fact,
I knew it.
The blue sheet.
Yes.
So think about how politics has changed dramatically. And sort of the break point is 1992. Let's take the election of '68. Compare it to the previous election. Democrats lost 18 points compared to 64. The Republicans picked up 4. In '72, the Republicans picked up 18 compared to the previous election. Democrats dropped 5. '76, the Democrats picked up 12 compared to '72. The Republicans lost 13. 1980, the Democrats lost 9 compared to the previous election. The Republicans picked up 3, and then there was an other for 7. '84, the Republicans picked up 8. 1988, Democrats picked up 5, Republicans dropped 6. 1992, Republicans dropped 16. The Democrats added 19 points. Think of the last 4 or 5 elections. 2008, the Democrats picked up 5, the Republicans lost 5. 2012, the Democrats picked up 2, the Republicans picked up 1. 2016, the Democrats lost 3, the Republicans lost 1. 2020, the Democrats picked up 3, the Republicans picked up 1. 2024, the Democrats lost 2.6 points, and the Republicans picked up 2.4. We've gotten, in this century, into a highly polarized environment. Yes, he got 312 votes in the Electoral College, big number. But in large measure, it was because the election is 49.9 to 48.4.
Right.
Think about this. This is another difference. Joe Biden got 81 million votes in 2020. Harris got 75 million.
Right.
She got 6,636,664 votes less than Joe Biden got. That's 8% less. 1 out of every 12 people who voted for Joe Biden in 2020 did not vote for her this time around. Donald Trump got 74,223,475 votes in 2020. This time around, he got 77,237,942. In other words, he gained 3 million votes, or basically 4%. 1 out of every 25 people who voted for Donald Trump in 2024 did not vote for him in 2020. Now, how does that compare? In 2004, John Kerry got 14% more votes than George Bush got. Excuse me, 16% more votes than Al Gore got. George Bush got 24% more votes in 2004
than he got in 2000.
Than he got in 2000.
Right.
So in this electorate, there were 6 million people who said, I voted for Joe Biden and got to get Donald Trump out of the White House, but I'm not voting for her. And only 3 million people who voted said, I didn't vote last time around for him or vote at all, but I'm voting this time around. So we are in a highly polarized period. The only other time in American history when we've had so many presidential elections that have been so tight, in which the movement between the two parties has been this small, is the last quarter of the 19th century, the Gilded Age.
Yeah. I want to take what Carl just said, because I knew he would go in that direction, and give you some
was that
basic
predictable?
numbers. No. Those are important numbers. But in this election, Kamala Harris, compared to Joe Biden, lost 400,000 votes in New Jersey, 400,000 in Texas, 1.9 million in California, 900,000 in New York, 400,000 in Illinois. What should Democrats learn from that?
Well, it's that they've got a problem.
Because why I mentioned those states is that's not where the campaign was most aggressively joined.
Battleground states. I mean, look, there are a whole series of these things. 3,143 counties in the United States. Not a single county flipped from being for Donald Trump in 2020 to being for Kamala Harris in 2024. You have to go back to 1932 to find a similar circumstance. Even when we get our ass kicked in 1936 and in 1964, there are counties that voted for Alf Landon that had voted for Roosevelt in 32. There are counties that voted for Barry Goldwater that had voted for JFK and LBJ. So this electorate is so highly polarized, and the Democratic Party has lost control of a key part of its constituency. It's not that it's lost that constituency, it's lost dominance among them.
And that constituency is?
Well, 4 or 5 of them. Blacks. Trump gets the highest percentage of the black vote since Ronald Reagan took 49 states in 1984. He gets the highest Hispanic vote since George W. Bush got it in 2004. And Bush had worked that community and had an enormous appeal in it. Women. You know, women who were supposed to be the driver of a Democratic victory this time around, women are, Trump did 3 points better among women this time around than last time. And here's the number that boggles my mind. If your income, your family income is $100,000 or less, you tended to vote for Trump. And if your income is $100,000 or more, you voted for Kamala Harris. So the blue collar working class, flyover American said, I'm voting for the guy who represents hope and opportunity and doesn't seem to be looking down his nose at me. This was both an economic election where people said the price of eggs is coming down, but it's still considerably above what it was when when this guy came into office with this running mate who's now the nominee of the Democratic Party. But the other part of it was, I'm an ordinary American, and there's a party who dominates the culture, dominates the media, seemingly dominates corporate America, and clearly dominates Washington, D.C., and they're looking down their nose at me. They're involved in a whole bunch of stuff, like men, teenage men involved in women's sports in high school and college, that doesn't seem to me to be right. And a whole bunch of other stuff. So Trump, give him his due, understood this, and on a I'm for you. In fact, that the ad that I think had the biggest impact, in fact, my Democratic friends tell me that inside Harris World, this was the biggest impact, is the ad on her on camera saying that she's in favor of transgender surgery and chemical therapy for men in prisons who want to change their gender to women. And she says, oh yeah, I'm in favor of that. And the tagline is, she's for they, them, he's for you.
Right.
And on some visceral level, people said, he's for me. And she's not.
When I was covering the Republican caucuses in Iowa, I said, before the results were known, that Trump was running and would run in this campaign as the incumbent, the challenger, and the victim. And I said that it was a very potent combination.
Why didn't you give me that line before you used it, man? That was a good line.
So you understand, and this audience understands the first two, but I want you to describe the political impact of the victim part of it, the legal procedures, which were perceived to be problematic, but in the end were politically advantageous to former
Well, they
President
look like
Trump.
a stretch. Look, and let me get it out of the way. I do think there was a fundamental issue in the classified documents case. I was in the White House for 7 years, and I had classification, and if I did what Trump did, we'd be having this conversation in the visitors' lounge at Fort Leavenworth.
Correct.
But the other parts of this thing were clearly problematic. When you have the DA in Manhattan saying, I'm running for office because I'm going to go after Trump, and then once he gets into office, goes after Trump on the basis of something that his predecessor, a widely respected Democrat, said, I'm not touching that with a 10-foot pole. And then when you had the prosecutor in Fulton County, Atlanta, go after him, and it turned out that she had hired her boyfriend at an enormous salary to prosecute this, and she too had run for office saying, I'm going after Trump. And Raffensperger, the Secretary of State, said, I don't take offense at what he did. So those started to look like they were stinky. And then he adroitly took the raid on Mar-a-Lago, which in my opinion was justified. They had evidence, that he had collected and maintained and held on to documents, and that turned out to be true. They collected several hundred classified documents that were in as a result of that raid. But he turned that into, they came into my house. Your former president, they came into my house, and they went into my wife's closet, and they shouldn't have done that.
Right. And it's clear that the Justice Department had tried to resolve this peaceably, quietly,
for
earlier.
a year and a half.
Right. And if you talk to anyone in the DeSantis inner circle, Mike Pence, Tim Scott, they all basically said their campaigns effectively ended that day.
Right.
Because the needle of sympathy went to Trump and never moved back.
Yeah. So the guy that...
How about the January 6th case for Jack Smith? Do you consider that problematic or close?
I'm not certain that people understood it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, at some point, the volume of this was such that people ultimately said, well, there's
It's all the same thing, and it's all one thing.
Right.
To get Trump.
Right. And look, I think it would have been different on Jack Smith if Jack Smith had been able to say there is a direct link between the people sitting there at the hotel in Washington who were in communication with the Proud Boys, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. If there was a link between them, Roger Stone, Steve Bannon, et cetera, and the White House. But they didn't have that link. And as a result, I think ordinary people looked at it and said, I don't get what this is all about. January 6th was stinky, but what exactly was, didn't he? And Trump had a great line, which was to say, I told him to do it peacefully. I want him to do so peacefully. And, that served him well. But, and the classified documents, you're absolutely right. They spent a year and a half. So Mark Meadows is either a hero or a goat. Because I hold him to be the guy who could have said on January 20th of 2021, he could have said, General Services Administration, you got a couple of trucks that are leaving with a bunch of stuff from the White House. Before you get on I-95, swing by the National Archives and Records Administration warehouse in suburban Maryland and take all the boxes of documents off the truck. Now, Trump would never have forgiven him, but we would have spared this as an issue because the law is clear. A president does not have a right to walk out of there with anything but his own personal records. Clinton walked out of there with the tapes of his private conversations with a guy who was going to do an oral history. The courts upheld that he had a right to do that. President Bush 41 walked out with his diary. It upheld that. There was a brief skirmish about Ronald Reagan and his diary. And in all instances, the courts held, or the Justice Department held, that they had a right to do that. But nobody has ever held that there's a right to take documents wholesale out of the White House. And it's clear in the law. And so it was a problem.
And it was also muddied by Joe Biden's problems.
Yeah, exactly. And so, but we could have been avoided this all if Mark Meadows, chief of staff, had said, you know what, I know what's in those boxes, because for fact certain, he was told a number of times by people, you cannot take them. In fact, the White House staff secretary, who has ultimate authority over those documents, left in the middle of December because he's not told me this, but because he left because he didn't want to. He'd said enough times you can't take them. And look, the president, they knew that he'd taken them. There's a little office in the staff secretary. That's a job that sounds like it's a nothing burger. That person sees every document that goes to the president and keeps a log of it. You know who George W. Bush's staff secretary was? A bright young lawyer named Brett Kavanaugh. And the lawyer who was there for Trump had that same job, and underneath him is a thing called the White House Records Office, which is on the White House staff, but is paid for by and hired by and directed by the National Archives and Records Administration, and they keep a log of every document that the president sees, including the classified documents, and a second log is kept at the National Security Council of every classified document that has to do with NSC work. And so within a matter of days after leaving the White House, the NARA, the National Archives and Records Administration, knew exactly that hundreds of classified documents had not been turned over because they had the logs. They had the log of the president saw this, but we don't see it in the stack of documents that we got. So this could have all been avoided if Mark Meadows, had stood up and said, I'll take the arrow, but I'm going to make the call as the president gets ready to leave and tell him, swing by and get those boxes off of there.
Mark Meadows took no discernible arrows.
No. As
chief of staff, which is something you have to do in that job.
Yeah.
You really do.
Yeah.
Carl mentioned how much George W. Bush increased his vote total 2004 to 2000. Campaigns pay compliments to each other indirectly by understanding how they win elections and taking the best practices. The Obama people did that after the 2004 election. Should anyone take anything from the Trump campaign in 2024? Were they more disciplined, more tactically improved?
This was Susie Wiles and Chris LaCivita did a terrific job because he's not the easiest candidate to work with. And they also had this problem. They had the problem of people, they needed to get the votes of people who had doubts about Donald Trump. They had the votes
in some cases, deep-seated doubts.
Yeah, they had the votes of everybody who was a Trump enthusiast. To the MAGA base, they would crawl over broken glass to vote for him. But that's insufficient to win the election because they were all for him in 2020. So they had to get the votes of people who had doubts. And there were two or three things that came into play that I think are going to be repeated, studied by future campaigns and repeated. One was the use of influencers. They had social media influencers who are ubiquitous and largely invisible to the people in this room. There was a guy, he was released by the Houston football team, defensive lineman, who was being paid $1 million a year last season and was making $7 million a year off his social media platforms. And there are hundreds of these people, sports figures in baseball, football, and basketball, and a lot of them were for Trump, and a lot of them were organized by, there's a guy who advises them on this, who is the nephew of Steve Wynn, the former hotelier. And this kid, he's in his 20s, has a business where he advises these people and also does poker tournaments. And what he did was he went to all of those contacts and said, if you're for Donald Trump, will you unleash your network and say things that are helpful to Donald Trump? And they did. And these people were talking each day to millions of voters who liked the voice that they were hearing from, and they were talking to him in a language that they had heard often from a trusted source.
They were a digital representation of what you used in 2004, the third-party verifier.
Right.
All right, so the influencers, what's another component part of the Trump campaign that will be studied?
Yeah, another part of it is that they took micro-targeting to its ultimate level, or at least the ultimate level available today. We used micro-targeting in 2004 to identify persuadable swing voters and low propensity voters. They used it to identify similar universes of targets. We used it in order to identify people who neighbors could talk to.
Right.
What they did was, now it is possible to take that list and run them by lists of their viewing habits and literally target television ads to individuals on that list. So that when you turned on your streaming, you turned on Yellowstone, and you were a target voter, you'd get an ad. You turned on Yellowstone and you were not a voter, you wouldn't get a Trump ad. Now, they spent most of their money on network and cable in battleground states, but they spent a significant slug on this, and it's far more impactful, because you literally are talking not to the dozens of people who've already made up their mind to vote for you or to vote against you. You're talking to the people who modeling shows you are the people who are absolutely up for grabs in the election, either because they haven't made a decision to vote or they haven't made a decision to vote for you. And you're talking to those individual voters. And because you've got that data, you can not only do that with television, you can also do it with video, you can do it with email, you can do it with digital, you can do it with neighbor to neighbor. I mean, you can cover those people up and target your campaign on them. The third thing is that they really did expand the number of people who are small dollar donors to the Republicans. However, the Democrats did an even better job, and the Republicans have got to figure out why, even with a highly profile person and candidacy in the form of Donald Trump, they were not able to keep up with the Democrats.
CBS News is part of a larger corporation called Paramount. Paramount produced Yellowstone, so thank you very much for that.
Don't worry, you won't be thanking me after when I tell a story about Paramount.
So also at this New York Times Deal Book Summit, Van Jones was there, and he said, Democrats have got to understand that digital is the new door knocking.
Right.
Stop talking about your numbers of door knocks, your numbers of phone calls. You must lay on your campaign, layer, what your digital footprint is and what your digital feedback is, and stop obsessing about phone calls and door knocks. How would you evaluate that?
I agree with half of that.
Okay.
I agree that the digital needs to be a part of it, but the door knocking and the phone calls matter a lot. So the question is, how do you use micro-targeting data in order to maximize the effectiveness of the door knocking and the phone calls? And that is to say, how do you get those phone calls and door knocks made by people who are neighbors? There's actually been a lot of work done on the effectiveness of door knocking and phone calls, largely done by a guy who was at Yale named Joshua Green, who's now at Columbia, who's done a whole series of studies in campaigns to show the impact of it, of the personal contact. And the one thing we know is that it does have a huge difference in how you turn out people marginally. Now, it doesn't mean that you can win 10% or 20% of the electorate, but in an election that's going to be decided by 2 or 3 or 4 points, the personal contact from somebody who is a committed volunteer on behalf of a campaign is powerful. Now, I said 2 words there, committed volunteer, that are important. And both parties have a problem with relying upon paid people to do the door knocking and the phone calls. And that's a problem because people can pick that up. Here in Texas, in the last 3 election cycles, underneath the radar, we've had a voter registration project in Texas that has added 600,000 new Republicans to the voter rolls here in Texas. And it is conducted by the use of micro-targeting data and then volunteers from the Texas Federation of Republican Women, who in each of the last 3 election cycles have made and completed over 1 million phone calls. Now, why is that important? Because these are committed volunteers. They're not doing it because they're getting paid, $12 an hour. They're doing it because they care, and it shows in their voice. It shows in their enthusiasm. We have two sisters. One is from Andrews County, and another one is from Ector County, and each one of them completed more than 45,000 phone calls over the course of 18 months.
That's commitment, ladies and gentlemen.
That's a commitment. In fact, we have 17 people, 2 men, husbands of TFRW volunteers, and 15 women who each completed more than 5,000 phone calls.
Yeah.
And, that shows through. When somebody cares about it.
So in other words, high touch still matters.
High touch still matters.
Okay.
So the Trump campaign, they went out and hired a bunch of people to do this door knocking, and that was a problem because,
That's my next question, because those of us who cover national campaigns and understand this high touch dynamic and believe that, or have come to believe, because history has instructed us this way, that in-house control of this is superior to subcontracting it. The Trump campaign made a tactical decision to subcontract to Charlie Kirk, Turning Point USA, and to a sort of pop-up that Elon Musk created of voter contacts. And we were reasonably skeptical about how this would work. Did it work? Is that going to be something that's going to be replicated and considered to be, in the aftermath, a successful allocation?
It'll be considered because the consultants get rich off of it.
Right. But was it a good idea? And did it work?
We're off the record here?
Sure. Hardly anyone's listening.
I don't know, is the short answer, because the ultimate test of this is, do you take all of your data and park it at data trust? Data trust is sort of, think of it as the Republican Party's sort of data warehouse. So to me, a test is, does an organization say, we're going to take all the information about the door knocks and phone calls that we made and park it at data trust so it can be evaluated? We did a voter registration effort nationwide in Montana, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Maryland, in conjunction, and Nevada, in conjunction with this election. And all the data is at data trust. So we say, here are the people that we called. Here are the people who went through the portal to get to, these are all states that allow, with the exception of Montana, online registration. In Montana, here are the people who said, send me a form. And here's the data on who actually registered and whose data on here turned out to vote. So somebody can go in there and say, how effective was that program? And get the numbers. Neither one of these two organizations put their numbers at data trust.
Right.
So I don't know. I do know this. I have a feeling that outside of maybe Arizona, that Turning Point had no impact. And they said they were in Wisconsin and Michigan. I had a donor who said, I gave them some money. They want some more. I can't get straight answers on what they're doing. Will you call, they want it for Michigan, will you call people in Michigan and say what they're doing? And I called around Michigan and said to the State House Representatives campaign, the U.S. Senate campaign, a couple of congressional campaigns, is Turning Point coordinating with you and sharing data? And all of them politely said basically no. Now a couple of them were impolite and said hell no.
Right.
But I could find no evidence of it. In fact, what I found was I could get evidence that they were involved in 2 state house races, one in a district the Republicans were never going to win, and one in a district where the Republicans were absolutely going to win. And the reason they were involved in those 2 districts was they had been involved in primaries and had supported the candidate who won the nomination and felt obligated to support him. But they're like, 100 and some odd districts in Michigan, state house districts. And yet, so I called the guy back up and said, sorry, I can't find, here's who I talked to, blah, 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 blah. And everybody's polite, or mostly everybody's polite. But no, there's no evidence. And he called me back later and said I confronted them about it, and they admitted that they'd raised too high their expectations, and they had made a mistake, and they'd committed to do things they couldn't do, and blah, 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 but I'm done giving them money. Look, I was a political consultant for 20 some odd years. My last political paycheck was December of 2000. Everything I do in politics today, I do as a volunteer. And I like to help organizations. I helped found what has become Senate Leadership Fund. Mm-hmm. But it's run by a set of rules with an independent board that sets the compensation of all the key employees, and we have strict policies about people getting paid under the table and getting a piece of the action. You know, you want to have these people who are taking the donor money to spend it with an idea of fiduciary responsibility to the donor to spend it the most effective way. I went in March of 2010 to visit Sheldon Adelson. We were starting American Crossroads Senate Leadership Fund, and I went to ask him for money, and we spent 6 hours being constantly interrupted. But at the end of it, he said, "How much do you want?" I said, "Mr. Adelson, would you consider $5 million? We raised $72 million that year, and we thought, God, this is unbelievable, $72 million. We raised and spent over $500 million this year, this cycle. But I said, $5 million, Mr. Adelson. He said, okay, I'm in. Tell me now, I just got one question. How much of this do you get? And I said, I'm sorry, what do you mean? He said, I know how this works. You're asking me for money, just tell me what is your percentage. I just want to know. I said, well, Mr. Adelson, I paid for my own airplane ticket to fly out here on Southwest Airlines and for your hotel room last night in your hotel, out of my own pocket. I'm doing this as a volunteer. I make a nice enough living that I can do it. He says, we're going to have a wonderful relationship. Mm-hmm. And we did, until he died. Because he trusted that he would support our organization because Senate Leadership Fund had these rules in place. I worry about super PACs. I helped create the largest one on the Republican side, and I worry about what they're doing to our ecosystem because they're run increasingly by, for, and the benefit of the consultants, not the candidates. Mm-hmm. And I'd rather this money flowed through the Republican National Committee if we were able to accept unlimited contributions, but because it can't, we have to have super PACs.
Sometimes there's a tendency among those of us in the media to oversimplify. I don't know if you've ever noticed that tendency.
Never happens to me.
So let me ask you an oversimplification question that may not even have an answer. Was there a moment in this campaign that you think crystallized the election and after which it was basically over?
Well, in retrospect, I'd see July 15th, Butler, Pennsylvania, on the Republican side. I mean, that moment, and he rises up on his feet, and blood flowing down his face, and says, "Fight, fight, fight." Yeah. You cannot help but be moved by that.
You cannot.
And the other moment would be June 27th, mm-hmm. And I literally felt ill. I felt sorry and ill watching Joe Biden at the end. Mm-hmm. It just was like, that is not the way you want to go out.
No. In a macro sense, in this election, as you were watching it, and there's a conversation that always goes on about the signal and the noise. What was the noise that you saw that you kept saying is missing the signal, and what was the constant signal? The constant signal was
the country, people are finding it hard to grapple with inflation. And, think how much it affects everybody's life. I mean, there are going to be a group of people for whom, the fact that when you go out to eat for dinner today, it costs a heck of a lot more than it did 2 or 3 years ago, or when you go to get, clothes for the kids at the beginning of school, it's a lot more for everything else, for everything. There are people, I get it, that don't feel that. But the vast majority of the American people are still grappling with this gigantic reset in their lives, in which prices have gone up far faster than their wages have.
And there are two cohorts, 18 to 29, 29 to 45, who have no lived experience with inflation.
Right.
Our generation did. You and I both remember it.
Right.
But for those two cohorts, they have no living memory of it, and it is a shock.
Yeah. Well, one of my students at UT said, I had a Happy Meal the other day, and it wasn't very happy. and it's because they remember their experience is, stable prices, and mm-hmm. now suddenly we had to go through the late 1970s.
So let me ask you this. It has been said many times since the election that this is no longer the Republican Party, it is the Trump Party. Statistically, is that true? Do you believe that to be true?
He's a dominant figure, but tell me what being a Trump party means. Does it mean that we have forsaken that commitment to low taxes and limited government and strong national defense? No. I mean, I thought it was interesting that two things that caught my ear. One is how often during the campaign Trump began to use peace through strength, which was the mantra that a lot of us remember established firmly in our minds by Ronald Reagan. And the other thing that got me was when he started talking about Bagram. Remember, here's the guy who set in motion the withdrawal in Afghanistan. My former White House colleague, Zal Khalilzad, was the negotiator.
Yep.
He's the guy who cut the deal that said 5,000, terrorists out of Afghan jails, and here's the withdrawal schedule, et cetera. And, if this had happened on the Trump era, we may have not had people killed getting out of Kabul, but we still would have had the same situation. And yet, Trump started talking about why did we give up Bagram? The beautiful runways are so long, so close to China. It's a wonderful place to fly out of. Why did we give, just beautiful, they're beautiful runways, long, strong. Well, where do you think our 2,500 US troops were? They were at Bagram, providing logistical services to the Afghan Air Force, providing coordination on intelligence collecting, training for Afghan special forces and Afghan air.
Had the negotiations actually gone on at Camp David, which Trump more than ever so slightly toyed with, that had been given up too.
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, that was the whole purpose. I mean, we didn't say we're going to take 2,500, we're going to take U.S. troops out of Afghanistan except at Bagram. It was we're going to get U.S. troops out of Afghanistan, and that's where they were, at Bagram. But it said to me that somebody talked to Trump, and eventually Trump sort of figured out, there was a reason to stay engaged in the world. Last weekend was the Reagan National Defense Forum at the Reagan Library, and I helped them draft their poll and analyze it. One of the interesting things was we were able to break out between all voters, Republicans, Democrats, Trump voters, Harris voters, and people with self-identified MAGA voters. 90% of MAGA voters want to increase the defense budget. Some, like 72% of them, 68% of all Americans want to maintain a military presence around the world. 72% of MAGA voters do. So so you're going back to your question, what's our party going to look like? I think it all depends on the next 3 or 4 years and who articulates a vision and how is that a vision affected by the conditions we find in the world. I don't think the Republican Party is going to move away from these fundamental tenets. They'll be modified because history never stands still. But I think that what it means to be a Republican will remain somewhat like it is today. There'll be a populist overtone, and particularly when it comes to culture. And
when that populist overtone, will it flow through something that is a kind of neo-isolationism? Will it flow through something that is much more aggressively skeptical, if not hostile to immigration? And will it be much more infatuated with tariffs?
Yeah, I don't know, but
those three seem to be the points on which there is great differentiation to the Reagan era and the George W. Bush era.
Yeah. So first of all, I'm Norwegian, so we're not allowed to be optimistic. Long winters, dark nights, but I am sort of optimistic. First of all, events will intrude.
They always do.
And when it comes to look, there's and again going back to the Reagan National Defense Forum poll, Republicans, Democrats, Trump voters, and MAGA voters all recognize that Russia's our enemy, Ukraine is our friend and ally. They recognize that it is a new problem for the country, that we have our 4 greatest adversaries, Moscow, Tehran, Pyongyang, and Beijing, working together. This is something we have not faced since the early days before World War II. And they recognize this is a difficulty. So I think there's not only an inherent sense when it comes to America being involved in the world and having a strong military and confronting our adversaries and defending our friends, that there's a recognition that this is in our interest. And I think conditions are only going to make that more apparent. Terrorism, Trump is going to have a different attitude towards this. But even he, and I took his statements about Syria to be wise ones, where we're not looking for a place to be involved. But on the other hand, when Assad said, or excuse me, when Obama said, if Assad uses gas on his people, it crosses a red line with me, and he did nothing, that hurt. And when Trump said it again, as a new president, I thought, oh, here we go again. Because he said, yes, it would cross a red line with me. And Assad used gas, and Trump responded. And if there's one thing that I think the world looks at Trump and says is, he's crazy enough to do exactly what he says. And so they're not going to screw around with him. You know, there's a reason why when he came into office, there were, I think, 6 out of 23 NATO countries were meeting their commitment to percentage of GDP on defense, and now it's 30 some odd countries. Now today it's 23.
Right.
And we got a couple of countries like Poland that are spending a higher percentage of their GDP on national defense than we are.
Right.
And I think that's a direct result of him and our able ambassador, Kay Bailey Hutchison, saying, he means what he says.
To be clear on that, Bob Gates started that job owning in the Obama administration, but Trump amplified it dramatically.
Yeah.
So let me ask you this.
He began it actually in the Bush administration. And his predecessor, Rumsfeld, did it in the Bush administration, but it's Trump that carried it. It was no longer words, it was also a gigantic bludgeon.
Let me ask you this. What is the trajectory for JD Vance?
I don't know. We'll see.
Do you think, meaning, you know what I'm getting at, is it unobstructed in 2028?
No, he's not. The rest of the Republican ticket in Ohio in 2022 won by between 18 and 24 points, including the incumbent governor, Mike DeWine, who's been a friend of mine for a long time, who has the personality of paint drying on that wall right over there. And he won by 24 points. JD won by 7.
He would readily acknowledge that, by the way.
Yeah, he would. He'd readily acknowledge that was one of his saving graces in being married to Fran, was that he was not an outgoing personality. But and that's after JD Vance, after our super PAC spent $33 million on JD Vance in Ohio in the closing 2 months of the campaign. No, I'm not the right person to ask about that. He's very smart. I'm not certain what the core is there. And if you run for president, artifice is not possible. You know, there's that great movie, The Candidate, Robert Redford. The basic thrust of it is all politics is bullshit.
Yeah.
They'll make up a phony ad and you know, they'll be able to take a charismatic, you know, looking guy and turn him into an office holder by artifice. It's more akin to, you know, Hans Christian Andersen, The Emperor's New Clothes. They're going to see you at the end of the parade naked. And they don't vote for a president because they're 100% perfect or 100% not perfect. They vote for him because relatively they think that they're better than the alternative. But they also will know you, and authentic is important. If you look at all the people who we have elected as president, they tend to have something inherent in them, which is they're more interesting and more approachable than their opponent. You know, everybody thought, you know, geez, I'd love to have a beer over the back fence with George W. Bush. You know, Reagan seemed to be a genial character. You know, Clinton was interesting. You know, Barack Obama being a historic figure, and, you know, sort of John McCain was sort of rough around the edges. And geez, you know, Trump cares about people like me, and she doesn't. So we'll see how Vance is able to do that, because here's the guy who 4 years ago said Donald Trump is Adolf Hitler. And today he's got a slightly different opinion.
Right. You mentioned culture a moment ago, and I don't want to overlook that. Tony Blair said more than 20 years ago, when people are nervous about their future, they don't lurch left economically, they lurch right culturally. Do you believe that to be true?
I think that there's a lot of wisdom in that, yeah.
How did that play out in this election on the cultural front?
Well, the culture worked against Harris. She was a California Democrat. California doesn't have a particularly good reputation nationwide, and particularly, think about it, 2 battleground states, Nevada and Arizona, have a lot of California refugees who left the Golden State for a specific reason. And so I thought that was one of they understood this, incidentally.
Meaning?
The Democrats. Or I should say Harris understood it. Think about that Democratic convention. Had you been to a Democratic convention like that one? This was patriotic, middle America. Her story was the American story. You know, single mom, two daughters. study hard, keep your nose to the grindstone,
Embracing of American exceptionalism.
You'd think you were at an Olympic event, they kept chanting USA, USA.
Yep.
And so this was not this was not Michelle Obama. I'm proud of my country for the first time in its history because you nominated my husband. This was not San Francisco Democrats. This was, by God, we love America, and Kamala Harris is the expression of the American dream. And remember, she gets introduced. What does she say? Harris for the people.
Right.
And, I'm a prosecutor, and I'm defending people, safety in their lives and their communities. Right. And so they understood this
the culture was
issue,
there. Yep.
But that was the only moment they got it. I mean, look, with all due respect, rolling out all these, music figures and actors and actresses and Oprah and blah blah and hyperventilating over is Taylor Swift going to endorse or not. This was not helpful. Anybody who was going to be affected by those votes was already in her camp. The person she had to reach for was the gal who'd started a landscaping company in Western Phoenix. It was the guy who was a master plumber in the suburbs of Raleigh, Durham, and had two assistants that he'd been able to hire. It was the out of work auto worker who'd now been forced to he's manning a cash register at the local grocery store. These were not people who were going to be affected by she's got the latest fill in the blank rock star or movie figure.
And to your point earlier, the celebrities were not nearly as important as these lesser known influencers.
Right.
Let me ask you this, that's a macro question. Clearly President-elect Trump is a historic figure. Any president who holds the office is someone who uniquely loses it then comes back, obviously. What historical figure who's been president before do you have any sense Trump is somewhat like? There have been comparisons to Andrew Jackson. There have been obviously comparisons to Grover Cleveland. I've even heard some people say this is a realigning election, so there might be William McKinley. You have a very deep affection for William McKinley. You may spit that out of your mouth, I don't know. But do you have anyone that you think of and that we should think of that Trump is resembling of or similar to?
Well, first of all, it's not Grover Cleveland.
Of course not.
Grover Cleveland was a deeply ideological figure. In fact, he loses control of the Democratic Party in the aftermath of the 1892 election because his party is increasingly bimetallic, that is to say, in favor of an inflationary currency, particularly after the country goes into a deep recession in 1893 and 1894, and he's a solid gold man. So, but he is a stubborn guy. But he is a thoughtful man who has created a view of what he believes America ought to be. It is not McKinley. McKinley was a gracious figure, admired and beloved by members of his own party. You think politics is bad today, the Gilded Age is worse. It is worse. One of the routine things that happened, we had 5 presidential elections in a row in which nobody got 50% of the vote. We have narrow margins. The last time the margin in the House of Representatives was this narrow was in the Gilded Age. We have wild swings where the Democrats take control of the electorate of the House of Representatives in 1874 for the first time in 18 years by flipping 92 seats. 64 of which are occupied by former Confederate generals, officers, and officials, including the Vice President of the Confederacy is now sitting in the House of Representatives 9 years after the end of the Civil War. One of the routine things that happens during this Gilded Age period is that the majority party in the House of Representatives, and we have divided government during this period. We have 4 years with a Republican president, House and Senate, 2 years with a Democratic president, House and Senate, and the other 18 years is divided government. And the House majority tends to flip more than the Senate majority. And what happens is the House majority, Democrat or Republican, picks out a member of the opposition who has won election by a small number of votes, phonies up an election challenge, and then votes to kick him out and replace him with their opponent so as to build the majority of the majority party in the Congress. Guess how many times between 1874 and 1904 this happens? 62. 62 times.
Yeah.
And in 1884, William McKinley is kicked out of the House. He won election by 50 votes, no fraud involved. He had a swing district, but he's won by only 50 votes, and the Democrats vote to kick him out.
Yep.
And the only unusual thing that happens is 7 leading Democrats, including the first speaker in 18 years, vote to keep him in as a mark of respect. So he's not McKinley, but he is close to Andrew Jackson.
Okay.
The first stolen election is when? 1824.
Yep.
The guy who wins.
Corrupt bargain.
Yeah, corrupt bargain. Yeah, the guy who wins 41% of the vote in a 4-way race, wins 11 of 20 states, wins 99 electoral votes, 33 short of the majority, is Andrew Jackson. And when it goes to the House of Representatives, he comes in second behind the guy who was a distant second to him, John Quincy Adams. In fact, 4 of the 11 states that voted for Andrew Jackson cast their one state's ballot in the Congress for John Quincy Adams. And for the next 4 years, Jackson spends all of his time decrying the corrupt bargain. Now the difference is going to be, again, Jackson had an ideology. He was a Democrat. You know, he made the name Democrat, but he was a Jeffersonian. He believed in strictly limited government. He had a set of principles, and he exercised those principles. He's a guy who, there is a bill that says we're going to create a road to take people west from Pennsylvania through what is now West Virginia and Kentucky, and to the rich land of the Middle West in order to make it easy to go there, and the Cumberland Pike, and he vetoes it. There's no right in the Constitution to have internal improvements. And so, but yeah, he was a rambunctious guy. He had a temper. He never forgave a slight. He carried 2 bullets in him till the end of his life that were the result of duels, and he was a man who saw himself as the tribune of the people.
Exactly. Transformed the presidency in that regard, because before that, members of Congress thought of themselves as the leaders, and the president not responsive and not someone who said, the people voted for me, I will do what the people want and you will follow me. Right. Congress thought it was the other way around.
Right.
Last question I want to put before you, we have to wrap up. As someone who pays attention to the opposition party, what Democrats do you think are the ones to keep a national eye on for the 2028 campaign, and what core level of advice would you give to Democrats after this election?
Yeah. Well, they got a lot of talent, and it's going to be interesting. Brashear of Kentucky, Shapiro of Pennsylvania, Whitmer of Michigan, Polis of Colorado, all of which are incidentally governors, are interesting. I don't see Newsom. He's got great hair, but he's California, and that ain't going to fly. And Pritzker of Illinois he's got too much weight on him. I can't see that he's got the profile of a presidential candidate. He's got several profiles.
Not to mention, Illinois has a lot of structural economic problems, led by Cook County, and those things are all going to be around his neck.
But there are going to be some other characters that pop up, and there are going to be some that are, the Clinton people were talking about in that brief period between June 27th and July 21st. They were talking about Mitch Landrieu. I don't think that's credible. But there are going to be other people that pop up here in the next couple of years, and we'll particularly see, are there any members of the House or Senate, more likely the Senate, whom we start to say that's a figure who represents what a Democratic Party ought to look like. But look, they've got some challenges, some real challenges, and each party has got a divide in it, ideologically and philosophically, and the Democratic divide in many respects is deeper than inside the Republican Party, and particularly when it comes to international affairs and economic affairs. I mean, are you a Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren Democrat, or are you a more business-oriented Democrat? Are you when it comes to this issue of Israel and Hamas and Palestine, it is ripping the Democratic Party apart. Whether we acknowledge it or not, vast elements of the Democratic Party are now in the resistance camp with a hostility to Israel that may continue to drive Jews into the Republican Party, which is, they left us in.
Even though it's worth noting, the exit poll data, and it's early, it'll be massaged and revived, but Harris got the highest percentage of Jewish self-identified Jewish voters of any Democrat in modern history.
Well, I worry about that because of one thing, and that is you all are participating in the NORC thing.
Sure.
We're talking about, in most of the exit polling, though, we're talking about a relatively small, I mean, Jews are 3 to 4% of the population. So if you have a 10,000 person sample, you've got a relatively small sample even then.
Like I said, there'll be refinements of it.
But if you look at the money and if you look at the activity inside the Democratic Party, who are the 2 Democrat House members who are knocked off in Democratic primaries? Avowed enemies of Israel. And look at what's happening on our college campuses and the reaction that we're seeing inside Democratic activists about the issue of Israel and Hamas and the post-October 7th.
After Trump, does the Republican Party need to rebuild itself or just look for the next Trump? That is the last question.
Yeah, he's sui generis, as we said earlier. He's unique. Nobody has his almost feral ability to figure out where people are and how to. I mean, think about the cabinet, his new cabinet. The best way to think about it is they're the product of the executive producer of The Apprentice. How are these people going to look on TV? And how are they?
There's a video screen upon which this is judged. It is not the only factor, but it is a significant factor.
Right. They're showing video of these people on a giant screen in Mar-a-Lago so that you can get a sense of it.
If he doesn't already.
Yeah. So I'm sitting in the Oval Office in May of 2020. I've been summoned to Washington to disabuse President Trump of the weird theory that if his campaign attacks Biden too much, that Barack Obama will step in and force Biden off of the ticket and replace him with Andrew Cuomo, and that Cuomo's running mate will be Michelle Obama, and that while they will be harder to beat than Biden, they can still beat him, but that's why we shouldn't attack Biden. And I've been asked to come to the White House to convince him that this is completely and utterly insane. And so I fly up there on a plane lent to me by a Houstonian, thankfully. My wife said, "You're not getting on a commercial flight. It's May of 2020. But I fly up there and I walk into the Oval. And Trump says, "Everybody know Carl? Carl, do you know Ivanka, Jared? You know Mark Meadows, my new chief of staff? You know Dan Scavino, Hope Hicks? Everybody know Carl? That 6 months been good to me. Before that, not so good." And so during the course of this, I've convinced him that this is a weird theory. But I learned something important about him. We're in the Oval Office where there are 15 people. I don't think I ever had a meeting in the Oval Office in 7 years with 15 people in the Oval Office. But during the course of it, in walks the very nice Molly Michaels, his assistant, and says, "Mr. President, Sherry, is it Sherry Lansing? Who owns?" Yeah, Sherry Lansing on the phone. Sherry owns CBS.
Redstone.
Yeah. Sherry Redstone. Sherry Redstone. Sherry, thank you for calling me. Yes, kiss, kiss, I love you too. Sherry, thank you for calling me back. I know you're so busy. Oh, no. I'm in a meeting in the Oval, but don't worry. Yes. Sherry, you may know something. I know something about ratings. Yes, I once had a program, it was called The Apprentice. So I know something about ratings. Sherry, fire the gal who's on your evening news. She's terrible. Your ratings will go up immediately. Yes, you too. Come and see me, I miss you. Yes, kiss, kiss, bye-bye. And I'm thinking, the President of the United States is spending 3.5 hours in a meeting in the Oval Office about a lunatic theory, and in the middle of it, he's firing his boss.
Right. Yeah.
But you got to look at him through that prism. Nobody else is going to be thinking like that. And nobody's going to have both the strengths and the weaknesses of being able to ferret out where people are.
So in other words, the Republican Party will be up for grabs.
Absolutely.
In a significant way in 2028.
Absolutely.
All right. He is a phenomenal Trump impersonator. I think we can all agree with that. And a brilliant mind and a great interlocutor. It's been my pleasure. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
We will be back in 15 minutes. Carl, you have a call waiting from Lauren Michael, who would like for you to do the cold open this weekend.
I could do a pretty good Clinton.